Nick asked me to talk, framing concept, the emerging era of education, and obviously in the context of what he's doing, I think AI and kind of AI is one of the key themes. But I think having reflected on this and a whole lot of things, I think the thing we can safely say is that AI will have a lot of profound effects across broader society, across jobs, across education. But I want to focus on the AI we have. There's lots of discussion around what's coming, in AI. And I think one of the things we know in thinking about the future is we often underestimate the impacts of the technologies we already have today, and we overestimate the impacts of the future technologies. So going to focus on what we have now, because I think there's going to be quite a profound shift in the way we think about information and needs of information that we need to be thinking about, especially in the education space. So really want to think about not just some of the obvious challenges, cheating on essays and assignments and all those things, but how AI, along the lines of the internet, I think is going to shift the value and purpose of education as the way we access information, the way we access knowledge changes. Nick helpfully kind of ran through some of the industrial revolutions and that concept. So I want to start by, naturally for a philosopher talking about the future, I want to start in the past. I want to give a bit of think about some of those, information revolutions caused by industrial changes and what they've meant both in terms of how we think about information, what we need, and then how education plays into that. And I'm thinking not just formal education, but education more broadly. So as Nick talked about with the Industrial Revolution, I think before that, if we think about, pick someone, I don't know, a farmer or a builder or someone, how did they learn what they needed to learn to be able to do their job, to succeed, to live in the world? 1600s, 1700s, there were books, there was printing press, but they were expensive, they were hard to access, and generally they were collected in some rich person's library somewhere. Most homes had a few, but not many. Instead, the education came from, it's much more an apprenticeship model. You learnt, but also what you learnt generally stayed current for your entire career, your entire lifetime. Once we got the Industrial Revolution, in terms of information, the key thing there is suddenly paper was cheaper, printing was cheaper. So there was a massive proliferation in newspapers, books, access. The industries, as Nick pointed out, needed people with more education, but the information was more accessible. You could then start keeping on track of more general person keeping on track of what some of the more latest ideas if you're a doctor in medicine were coming out, promulgated, and you could be expected to keep up with that education. So there was a lot more access to education. It was information more freely available, still limited. And we kind of went from private rich people's libraries to public libraries, school libraries, and where they were, university libraries. So that meant people needed a broader range of information. You needed to be able to keep on top of that. And that was, as Nick said, when we started getting mass schooling, primary schooling, secondary schooling, partly driven by the information that was accessible, and then you could be expected to keep on board with it. Jumping forward, particularly post-mid-20th century, a major industrial revolution in terms of the global logistics and supply chains. Suddenly, a country like Australia, a small town like Canberra back in those days, could have fairly up-to-date the latest information, latest books, the latest things from around the world, in a way that 20 years ago took much longer, harder to access. And this was the period, I think, partly in response. This information, this knowledge, we will now be able to tap into more of the global knowledge. Became critical for industry, critical for government. We were looking to implement the latest, and people needed to be across that to do their jobs. If you think about, pick the doctor again, in the 1800s, there were kind of regular changes. By the time we're getting into the later 1900s, the latest methods, techniques, things people had to be across were changing every 5, 10, 15 years in the way they weren't. The challenge we had then was, how could your average person be across this, learn this information? Because there's a lot there, but being able to synthesize, access, learn it, keep across it was really very much a full-time job. And in that context, I think The universities, post-World War II in Australia, governments invested hugely in universities. Was one of the purposes, whether understood or not, was as an accelerator of knowledge diffusion. If you paid a bunch of people to read the latest research, be across it, collect it all in libraries there, that could then get distributed around government, around industry in a much more efficient way. If you wanted to find out the latest, go and talk to a university academic or someone who's doing the reading, because they were the people who had the time to be across it. So we'd gone from information was more local to broader, big access to a global, but the fundamental limitation there was being able to learn the knowledge. And I guess that knowledge was critical for how we were successful. So what we needed to do in a lot of education was needed to teach people the information, get them up to speed so they knew the latest, the greatest, what they needed. Then the internet came. Suddenly the monopoly libraries, universities, academics had on access to information disappeared, more or less overnight, but not quite. Suddenly, instead of needing to go somewhere in particular to get access to the latest information, you could all access it on your computer, then on your phone. And so we went from a situation where there was a huge amount of important knowledge and information out there that we wanted to access, but it was hard. So there was a huge amount of information out there and it was really easy to access. The problem is we struggled. How do we know? How do you make sense? How do you deal with the deluge of information that's online? I think one of the challenges education institutions have faced in the internet era is that previously they had something of a monopoly. The teachers, the lecturers, the academics knew a lot more and had access and had spent the time to absorb the information. And people felt like they needed to go to those experts to be able to learn stuff. With the internet, people don't feel like they need to go and speak to anyone to get access to the information. What they need, often they felt they need, is help. How do we make sense? We've got this conflicting information. What does it mean? How does it situate? But I think there's been a big culture clash in that academics, to pick on academics, often still have the mindset that I'm the expert here who's going to tell you what you need to know. But people out there don't tell me what we need to know. Tell me how to make sense of this or work through it or figure out how it works. And I think that's underlied a lot of the tensions in the university sector, what government's looking for. I mean, I know I worked in government for a few years and worked with a lot of government agencies. Academics often a pejorative term. Two, you go find stuff, you go and talk to the academic or the experts who look interesting, who can help you. And it doesn't matter if they're in Turkmenistan or the UK or the US. The fact that there is this confluence of great universities in the small town Canberra, as Richard helpfully pointed out to us earlier, doesn't actually mean that much in terms of where people go, who they talk to, because you find who's useful and interesting. I think this also is reflected in some of the trends in schools, away from learning knowledge to developing skills, because we needed skills to kind of understand how this worked and what that meant. Whether that's successful or not, it's a different question, and I'm sure but it's that mindset shifted. With AI, and particularly the large language models like ChatGPT, I think we've hit another significant change in that information environment. In my view, the one thing that they do really well is they synthesize a vast amount of information and churn out 3 dot points, 500 words, whatever version it is, that synthesizes whatever information that you're looking at. It's not always accurate. We all know there's hallucination problems and things, and I think there's reasons why they won't go away, but we can talk about that later. But it's a really interesting, if you think about the structure of information, gone from inundated with information with the internet that we struggle to make sense of. Now we've got AI that can synthesize it and give us the neat packaged answer that we think we want. That changes the relationship with information, how we act, how we're going to interact, how we think about information, where we go in ways which we're only starting to see. I think, again, the internet took 10, 15, 20 years to have the impacts. I think we're going to start. So it's going to change our relationship to how we think about information, who we trust, where we go, what that means. What does this mean for education? I think the context there has come up before. Why do we educate people writ large? It's not just for its own sake. It's not just for knowledge's sake. We want people to be good people, good citizens, good members of society, good at their work, whatever that is, whether it's paid work, whether it's volunteering, whether it's at home. And so the test should be, can they do what we want them to be able to do well at the end? I think through my kind of potted, very brief history lesson, I think for the last 150, 200 years, one of the big limitations we've had to be able to do anything well, farming, doctors, nursing, has been there's knowledge, information out there that would help us do it better, and we need to know that information. There's been a limitation on access of knowledge. With the internet, there wasn't a limit of access of knowledge, there was a limit of being able to, I guess, synthesize it and apply the knowledge. The problem now is we've got that gap's shrunk. AI will provide us at least what looks like that targeted specific knowledge in a form that we can make sense of and apply it to whatever we want at the touch of our fingertips. But the question is, does that actually help us do things well? Does it help us be good at our jobs? Does it help us any of those dynamics that we actually should care about? I think this creates a really interesting challenge because historically, one of the ways we've taught people how to understand what's good, make good decisions, develop judgment, be able to apply things well. So we've expected people to go through all the information, think it through, synthesize it. And the way you can test whether they've done it is some form of synthesis, whether it's an essay, whether it's a response, whether it's a debate. How do we do that in a world where people don't feel the need to go through the synthesis process because there's something there that will do it for them? I think what this brings up a challenge is that our limitation was on knowledge, but increasingly it's not the access to knowledge, it's how do we do well. And that means we need to be thinking about how we build judgment, applied wisdom. How do we actually make the right decisions to do the right thing in this situation, which I think is something that used to be able to rely on synthesis, but AI is not going to be able to help us with in the same way. Pick, a teaching example. You can learn everything you want about managing a classroom and teaching strategies. Then you can walk into a classroom and actually try and teach. What you apply, when you apply and teach it, is an entirely different set of skills. What you've learned in terms of the knowledge can help, but actually doing it, you learn so much more and you develop that judgment and skill or wisdom, if you want to call it that. So that's the question of how do we build that judgment, how do we build that wisdom in new ways that we can't do simply by learning knowledge, or at least we can try and get people just to learn knowledge, as we did. But it doesn't fly with young people these days in the same sense. Why do I need to learn all this stuff when I can just look it up? Conversation came up before, why do I need to do mental addition when I can just use a calculator? It's that same dynamic. How do we build those skills? How do we build that judgment? I think because AI is I think in the end, building that practical wisdom always comes from actually doing something. It's the doing, trying, experimenting, failing, achieving, actually the kind of grind of achieving anything, whether it's teaching, whether it's doing your lab experiments. There's always a difference between how you write down the method and how it actually works when you try and do it. Whether it's raising a child, you can read as many parenting books as you want, but it's an entirely different thing. So that wisdom that we really want, because we want education so people are good at their jobs, their skills, good citizens, comes from being active, dynamic. So that's, I think, and this is my hypothesis, I'm interested in people's reactions, whether you think this is plausible or not, that the way education will need to go, given AI, is more dynamic, more active, more debates, more labs, more scenarios, more games, more interactive things. So we're putting people in situations where they actually have to do, act, react, think it through. I think the critical part then is the critical reflection bit in terms of that they learn from that. rather than just learn for test's sake, rather than just absorbing knowledge. So how do we put them in situations where they're learning in that dynamic way, so they actually build not knowledge for the sake of it, but judgment, wisdom, how to do whatever they're doing well. What does that look like in the kind of coming context? I think more labs, more debates. I think the stuff Nick's talking about with his business are good ideas, great ideas. I think the really interesting one in terms particularly the AI is there's an ability potentially to scale that up. I think the real challenge that we have is a lot of this interactive dynamic stuff is more intensive, it's harder, it's always taken more time. The model they have here at Lachlan Macquarie Institute is very person resource intensive, but we're trying to do mass education. So I think there's potential in the AI. But along that, I think the critical part is we need to also think about how we can use AI to build wisdom. We also need to build wisdom, build judgment about AI. What it can do, how it can do, where the limits are, what AI does well, what it doesn't well, when we can trust it. And I think the really interesting thing is as you use AI more, you get that sense of where the limits are, how it works. And we have to be realistic that the jobs of the future, particularly white collar jobs, but people will be using AI in various forms for various different things because organizations will want it for productivity and efficiency. So how do we use that to actually build the judgments that people can make good decisions, pick when to use it, when not to, but also not lose that skill that we've traditionally taught in ways that I think AI can at least fake to really help us educate people so that they are good at work, good judgment, good people. That's, I think, where the challenge is. So really the challenge I think we need to be thinking about is how do we help people build the wisdom that they need to good judgment, be good people in a world where, to be perfectly honest, they strictly don't need to know anything because all that knowledge they can access, at least in that felt need, they don't feel like they need to know anything. How do we help people build wisdom in that context? I think Nick's stuff's really interesting potential, but I'll be interested in people's responses, reactions. Is that the real challenge?
Thank you.